This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
So hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm excited to introduce you to Sarah McCraw Crow. When it comes to writing fiction and reading, Sarah is obsessed with women's lives and the drama of family life. She also loves the 70s. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College, Stanford University, and Vermont College of Fine Arts, and lives with her family on an old farm in New Hampshire. And she joins me today to talk about her debut novel, The Wrong Kind of Woman. Welcome to Uncorking Story, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there in that intro. But the first question I have to ask you is, Sarah, where does your story as an author begin?
Well, I guess I would say, like a lot of writers, maybe most writers, I was a super bookish kid. I was always reading and rereading and obsessive about certain books. And then after college, I went to journalism school and figured I would get some kind of a writing job. But I really didn't think of myself as a creative writer. I thought of myself as somebody who could write in a non-fictional way. And so I've got work working for women's magazines. And when I was a sort of a baby editor, I worked in the books and fiction department at Ladies' Home Journal. And that was long enough ago that most magazines had fiction. They would run fiction most months. And even like Ladies' Home Journal would have like Joyce Carol Oates one month and then Danielle Steele the next month. It was like free for all, but there was a lot of fiction. So I was reading all the time for that job.
Right.
And I sort of noodled around with fiction, but I honestly didn't get serious about it till I was probably 39 or 40. And I think that was partly because my kids were getting a little older, and partly I was maybe getting a little braver and decided I need to be intentional about this and really learn to write fiction and see what happens. And so I started taking classes and going to writers' conferences and joining writers' groups and basically being brave enough to put my work out for feedback, because that's really what you need. You need other eyes on your pages. And so it's been kind of a long, slow, late bloomer kind of road, I would say.
Well, I mean, I talked to so many authors and being one myself who started much later in life. It happens when the time is right for you, I think. Whether it's life experiences or, life changes, you see the world a little bit differently, then sometimes you just figure, okay, well, now's the time to start. But I'm curious, like, why did you think that you weren't much of a creative writer? I mean, it sounds like you were a big reader and you were bookish. You clearly were interested in writing to study journalism, but why, what was it? Was it like a limiting self-perception or?
Yeah, I think it was just a confidence thing, maybe, or maybe the idea of, sort of like when you're in high school and everyone is grouped into different categories. And sort of similarly in college, I had an idea that certain people were the creative writing people, and they were, what I think I thought it was that certain people had it and certain people didn't have it. And they were people who were writing novels at 19 and taking all creative writing classes and just writing lots of poetry and fiction. And I had done my share of that, but I just didn't think I was one of those people. I don't know. It sounds a little bit crazy. And I regret that I didn't put myself out there to, take an intro to fiction class in college. But my other memory about that is those classes were really hard to get into. And maybe I was just avoiding rejection ahead of time or something like that.
Yeah, avoiding rejection is a funny notion for people who write, especially people who write fiction, because rejection kind of comes with the territory, doesn't it?
Yes, totally. And I mean, I had no idea about any of that at 18 or 19, but I just decided that I was not that kind of person, which is silly. Yeah.
So I know we're going to talk about The Wrong Kind of Woman, but was that your first stab at writing fiction, or are there a few manuscripts that are kind of collecting dust somewhere?
Oh yeah, I've got the many novels in the drawer. Well, I have lots of false starts, or I wouldn't even call them false starts. They were just things I couldn't finish that I wrote over the years. And then I probably have three novels or three or four novels in the drawer. And one of those novels actually did get me an agent. So that was actually a historical novel about John Singer Sargent, the artist, and his sister. And so that was something I spent a lot of time on. And then while that was out on submission, I started another project, and that's the project that became this book, The Wrong Kind of Woman.
Got it. Well, tell me about the finding the agent, because I think that's an interesting. First of all, it's hard to find an agent, but it sounds like you had a book that was, what I would call agent worthy, right? Good enough that an agent's going to pay attention to it, but unfortunately doesn't sell. Just kind of walk me through what that experience was like for you.
Well, so the finding part was sort of your typical where you think your novel's ready and you start sending out query letters and keeping a spreadsheet. And I was looking for agents that either represented books that I loved, or I mean, I was pretty clueless, but I queried a lot. I probably ended up querying about not quite 50, so like high 40s. And I got a fair amount of requests for partials and fulls, and then rejections after that. And so that process was it seems like most of the writers I know have that process. And when you hear about it the other way, where some agent requests your work and you only query one agent and you have that kind of magical experience, that's kind of the exception. Yeah. And so, but as far as just quickly, a lesson about querying is I think most people think their novel is ready to query before it is. And you end up kind of wasting your shot by querying too soon. But there's sort of no way to know that really until it's kind of I don't really know what the lesson is, but I guess the lesson is don't rush into querying. Take your time with your manuscript.
Yeah.
And then, when I landed with my agent, I revised that historical novel a couple of times for her, and she said she thought it was ready and started to come up with a list for submissions. And that whole process probably took not quite a year. I think sometimes it takes even longer, but the feedback was pretty clear. It was always pretty complimentary, but the kind of damning word was it's too quiet. And quiet is a word that it doesn't really even mean very much to people, but I think it's just sort of shorthand for an editor to say it's not propulsive enough, or it made me, I thought the language was pretty, but I could put it down. It wasn't, keeping me turning the pages. So I understand that a lot better. That's just one of those words that editors and agents use. So, but the good advice that I had heard, and maybe you've heard this too, which is, when you're querying and waiting for people to get back to you, and then when your book is out on submission, do start that other project, or start more than one project. Just keep yourself busy with other stuff, because there's always going to be waiting. When you're in that publishing pipeline, or before you get to that pipeline, there's a lot of waiting.
Yeah, the waiting is the hardest part sometimes, as Tom Petty said.
Yes.
Tell me about the importance and impact for you on those writers' conferences and writers' groups you spoke about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've gone to some different kinds of writers' conferences. Some are just weekend-long conferences, like Grub Street's conference in Boston that's called Muse in the Marketplace, and others that are longer, like Sewanee, where you kind of dive in for 10 days. And for me, I think aside from the workshops, which can be sort of painful, as you know, when everyone's reacting to your stuff and you are listening to what people are saying and just taking notes and trying to make sense of it all. I think it was the connection with other writers and being in a place where it's just all writers and everyone's talking about writing or the books they loved, and you feel like, oh, I'm with my people. for a little while. So I think it was actually connections as much as it was, or I should say community, as much as it was lessons about writing.
Yeah. Yeah, because writing is such a solitary process. I mean, for most people, I know there are people who do work very well and collaboratively with like in a co-author relationship, but
Hmm.
it is a very solitary process until you're towards the end, really. I mean, towards the end, where at least you think you're towards the end,
Right.
you're putting in front of agents or maybe some beta readers or things like that. But writers conferences, writers groups really are that opportunity to get some feedback earlier on and also get some encouragement too. And I'm curious as to what
Mhm.
role encouragement may have played through writers conferences and writers groups.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think the encouragement is also often just came in seeing other people doing the same thing and struggling over the years. And um, I've thought of other writer friends who I made at some of the conferences who were about my age, who'd been writing for a long time and didn't really have much to show for it. And then that's the kind of thing that lets you feel like, oh, it's not me. It's just, this is the way this weird business works. It can take a really long time. Um, and then I guess the encouragement comes maybe later when, um, if I'm emailing a writer friend and we can commiserate, or we can say, you know, keep sending it out. I'm in a writers group right now with some friends from grad school. And that's one thing we do keep saying to each other. Like, one of us is in the process of querying agents, and the other two of us, will say to her, you've only sent out, you know, 8 queries. That's not enough. You need to really keep going. And she's like, okay, I'll do it. And so there's that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about The Wrong Kind of Woman. What can you share with us about that book?
Well, so The Wrong Kind of Woman is a kind of a campus novel because it's set in 1970, and it's set around the campus of Clarendon College, which is my fictionalized version of Dartmouth College before coeducation, when it was all male and a lot more like Animal House. And it's a story about 3 people who are all grappling with the death of the same person. And that person is Oliver Damaris, and he is or was a history professor at this little college. And he dies too soon and suddenly in his early 40s. And his wife, who's now a widow, and my main character, Virginia, is left to pick up the pieces. And she's mired in grief and kind of muddling along. And she starts to realize that she'd spent a lot of her married life kind of propping Oliver up professionally because he had a lot of doubts about his work. And she's also she's helped out by 4 women who Oliver really didn't like, and those are the 4 women faculty at Clarendon. And the male faculty have given them a kind of derogatory nickname of the Gang of 4. And Virginia kind of resists their efforts at first, and then slowly starts to be friends with them. And they all start to work together to bring a little bit of change to their campus and the town. And at that point, things start to go awry. And so her story unfolds that way. And then I have 2 other main characters, and they are Rebecca, Virginia's 13-year-old daughter, who's adrift and really missing her dad, and just kind of trying to hang on to her best friend. And then Sam, who's not in their family, but he's a 20-year-old college student at Clarendon, and he's musically talented and mathematically talented, but he doesn't fit in because Clarendon is such a jockey and fratty kind of place. And he's lonely, and he's wondering what his grief about Oliver says about him. And both Rebecca and Sam are going to blunder into danger for different reasons, but in ways that are going to change them. So that's a little bit of the story in a nutshell. But the one other thing is, because we're in 1970, there's still the background pressure of the Vietnam War, which is still going on. And so there's the, all the stuff that goes along with it. So the draft and the anti-war movement and the student strikes and big protests and, more radical activism like the Weather Underground, which is really more like terrorism than activism. and even the women's movement becoming more prominent. And all of that kind of stuff, those pressures have felt far away from these characters until pretty recently, but that's going to be kind of acting on them in this story.
Yeah. Well, your character, is it Virginia, the widow?
Mm-hmm.
Um, just the way you've painted her and talked about her really fascinates me, because it seems like this. I mean, could this be a coming of age story for her? It sounds like she may not have known herself
Mm-hmm.
or found herself because of, having to prop up and support her husband so much, emotionally. Is this part of it? Is like her finding herself and her voice?
Totally. And thank you for picking up on that, because I think it's a coming of age story for all three.
Mhm.
I've had this theory for myself for a long time that we're always coming of age. And I love seeing novels where someone comes of age at a different time. I mean, I realized that coming of age means you're becoming an adult, you're not a child anymore. But there's another kind of layer to it where you become yourself or your truer self. And that is definitely what she's doing, as is Rebecca and Sam.
Yeah.
They're also coming of age.
Yeah, I love the notion of an adult, somebody in her 40s, coming of age, because I think there's so much focus. You think coming of age, you think, high school, teenage,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
kind of drama, but there are so many people who get into their adult life, very young, and don't really experience life all that much. Um, they
Mm-hmm.
because of whatever decisions they make. And I'm thinking somebody specifically in my life who, was married young and didn't really have an independent life as an adult. Um, so I think that, like, for those people, that that character would really speak to them. I mean, it just not even having read your book yet, it speaks to me.
Oh, well, I think that is true. And if you, especially if you go back a couple of generations and you think of people, men and women alike, but I'm really thinking of women, if you're young in the 40s and 50s, you probably did slip into marriage pretty quickly. You went from your parents' house to your husband's house, and you missed that time of um, your own solo growth, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah, so that definitely I think of as a generational thing for women who'd be in their 80s and 90s
Yeah.
today.
It's
Mhm.
interesting, because that is my mother. My mother's 89.
Mhm.
Married now to my dad for 65 years. God bless them. But that is my mother, married young, kids, didn't have a career outside of raising the kids. I mean, she had some jobs,
Right.
but not what you call a career. But not her mother, like my grandmother, who was an Italian immigrant, was like a force to be reckoned with. I mean, to talk about like an independent business owner, in the 20s, it was just it just really kind of interesting.
That is interesting. And I wonder if part of that was the pressure of the 50s, the sort of post-war, because my mom was the same way. She taught for maybe 2 years and then she was having kids and she didn't go back to work till she was probably 50, I would say.
Yeah,
And I think that was what the culture was telling the women to do.
yeah.
And so if you had enough means to not work, then you probably didn't. So, and I'm curious, I'm thinking about the women in the 20s, if that was a time of maybe more expansiveness and different possibilities
Yeah, I
compared to
think
the 50s.
it was also like an immigrant story too. So,
Mm-hmm.
she was a seamstress. She was a designer. She was in business with Oleg Cassini. She taught
Oh,
him,
wow.
and like Jackie Kennedy wore her dresses. It's wild.
Oh,
It's wild. I
have
mean,
you written about her?
no,
Would
well, I've
you?
written about my grandmother, but in more like journaling and
Mm-hmm.
reflection pieces. But she didn't get the credit for any of that.
Right.
But she
Mm-hmm.
was the force. I mean, it was her, and she was not a woman to be reckoned with either.
Well,
Um,
if you wrote that novel, I would definitely read it.
I
I
probably
really love
should,
all that.
because I want to write a period piece, but which leads me to my next question for you: the 70s. I
Mm-hmm.
love that this is taking place during the 70s, and I think because it is such a colorful time. There's great music, but there's a lot of tension. There's
Mm-hmm.
there's the explosion, the revolution of the 60s is like still going on in the 70s. You've got the Vietnam War. But we also don't have things like cell phones. So I'm
Right.
curious, was it hard not to kind of, because they're like such a part of our life? Was that a challenge for you not to like put modern technology in the story, or keep it out of the story?
I would say it really wasn't that much of a challenge. I think that makes it certainly makes it easier for plotting and things when there aren't cell phones, because you can't know what people are doing at any given moment. There's a couple of scenes in this novel where things are happening that a cell phone would answer the question and change everything really quickly. But that's not really your question. I would say I did not have trouble with that, just because I tried to immerse myself in the time and try to remember what I could remember from the 70s. And, things like reading the newspaper, or two newspapers coming a day, or the stuff that was on TV or on the radio. And so or thinking about the landline, which we didn't call a landline in the 70s, which is like you pick up the phone and you can't go very far. You can pull the cord and tuck the phone under your shoulder. But yeah, no, I actually enjoyed trying to think about like, what was it like, and try to call up all the stuff that I could remember.
All right. Kids won't understand today is like that wall phone in the kitchen. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes you can get one of those really long, curly
Right.
cords for it. But then having that curly cord like bunch up, and then you have to
Mm-hmm.
hold the receiver down to unwind it. Like, my kids will never learn that struggle.
No. Or
They'll
the thing
never
of
get it.
you're if you're a teen and you're trying to get a little privacy, like we had one too with the kitchen phone with a long cord, and it would stretch into the dining room. So you like go in the dining room, try to close the door, and you know, not have everyone in the family hear you.
Right.
But yeah, it was different.
Yeah, a different time. What
Mhm.
fascinates you about the 70s?
Oh, I don't know. I just have a lot of affection for that time period. And I don't know whether that's the first era that I was aware um, of, stuff around me, or what. But what you mentioned about the 60s, kind of overflowing into the 70s, is something that has fascinated me for a long time, that we think of everything happening in the 60s, but a lot of the sort of outcome of the 60s was really happening in the 70s. And I think sort of culture-wise, pop culture and politically, it was a more optimistic time. I mean, despite recessions and gas shortages, there was still, I think, a sense of um, possibility. Like the original title for this novel was The Year of the Woman, because the first year of the woman was 1972, because this wave of women came into Congress and everyone was like, oh, things are different now.
So how
So
did you come
yeah.
up with the title, and why pivot to The Wrong Kind of Woman, which I love as a title?
Mm-hmm.
But how did that come out?
Well, I love the title too. And it's so funny when you ask writers about their titles, because so many times they've like changed over and over. And the Year of the Woman was the title that my agent and I had settled on after I had been through like lists and lists of titles. Because I think my first working title for her was something like Westfield or That Clarendon Year. And she was like, no, you need something that's a little more um, descriptive, I guess. And so after I got the book deal, the first thing my editor said was something like, everyone hates the title, or you're going to have to change the title. So I went back to the drawing board and came up with another list that had like woman, year, different, word combinations. And my editor emailed one day and said, well, I'm sure this will be okay with you since you came up with it, but it's unanimous. Everyone loves The Wrong Kind of Woman. And I went back and looked at my list, and I didn't come up with that title. And I feel really stupid that I didn't, because it's a great title, because of course it raises questions like, okay, who is the wrong kind of woman, and why and how? And so yeah,
Yeah,
it was a long and kind of funny process.
yeah. I mean, the title alone does pull you in because you want to know, well, who's the wrong kind of woman.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I
And
want to.
there's not like a wrong kind of man. I mean, I have a Google alert set up for The Wrong Kind of Woman, and it comes up not always for my title. It comes up because reporters will use it in a news article, or somebody will call someone a wrong kind of woman, and you never hear like the wrong kind of man. So
Interesting.
mhm.
Interesting. Well, I have some other questions for you. And these are all in the spirit of getting to know my guests on a different level. Always starting off with pop culture. So, Sarah, I'm curious, when you were growing up, what were some of your favorite things to watch on television?
Oh, okay. I watched a lot of television when I was growing up, and I think the things that stayed with me more are the things I watched when I was younger rather than older. Like I watched a ton of TV when I was a teenager, but I don't have vivid memories of those shows. But I do have vivid memories of the shows I watched when I was pretty little. Like I can remember, um, I'm pretty sure the Saturday night lineup in the early 70s was Mary Tyler Moore, Bob Newhart show, and then Carol Burnett. And I think that was on CBS. And I can remember being allowed to stay up late. And I remember like those shows are just like lodged in my memory from,
Yeah.
Sort of fairly early childhood.
You talk about Mary Tyler Moore uh oh, why did I just blank?
Rhoda.
No, the Carol Burnett. Sorry.
Oh yeah.
I don't know where my brain is. They were certainly not the wrong kind of women, especially for for TV.
Mhm.
I mean, really breaking some ceilings there.
Totally.
Mary Tyler
Yeah.
Moore and even Carol Burnett and that humor. I mean, side-splittingly funny. And I
So
only
funny.
watched her shows in reruns, but I mean, when she would break in front of the camera, it was even
Mhm.
like it just even made it funnier.
It was so funny because a lot of times like Tim Conway would break, or somebody else would, and she could hold it together longer, and then she would,
Yeah.
fall apart. And it was so hilarious. But yeah, I think that is of a piece of that optimism of the early 70s, that that things were possible for Mary Richards on the Mary Tyler Moore show. And um, the same with a lot of the other sitcoms like All in the Family and the Jeffersons and Maude. It was like, we're in a new era, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly some rule breaking TV there too. I mean, with All in the
Hmm.
Family, I got in this conversation with somebody the other night. I mean, that was a show that, addressed bigotry from the point of view of a bigot. Um, and it was, I think again, also groundbreaking.
Yeah.
Also groundbreaking. And then the Jeffersons, just having, you didn't see middle class African American families on TV. It was always,
Right.
poor African American families, whether it was Good Times or What's Happening.
Right.
But this was saying, hey, and then of course the Cosby Show even it continued with that. But yeah, really, really groundbreaking stuff. And I don't know if did you catch when Norman Lear does those they do these live shows. I think Jimmy Kimmel
Yeah.
does it. They'll recreate an episode of a Norman Lear show
Hmm.
on live TV. I always thought that was the past few years. I think last year they did. Now, what did they do last year? They did the Jeffersons recently. They did
Yeah.
All in the Family
They
recently.
did, yeah, they did All in the Family, because I remember watching that with my husband, and it was with I think Woody Harrelson was
Woody
playing
Harrelson.
the
Yeah.
Archie Bunker role, and it just didn't have the same. I don't know what, but I don't know if I went back and watched All in the Family now, if I would be like, ooh,
Yeah.
it's not funny anymore.
Yeah. Interesting. What about music?
Yeah.
What were you listening to music wise growing up?
Music wise, well, as a teen, I was in the sort of prime early MTV era. So I would watch or listen to, I mean, you could plop me down in front of a TV and I would watch MTV for 5 hours if I could. Just to like see what was out there, like different stuff that wasn't on the radio, like more British, that sort of new wave music and that kind of thing. Um, but for, I guess, albums that I was buying as a teen would be more almost like romantic's not quite the right word, but more in the like Roxy Music and
Yeah.
Elvis Costello and Marshall Crenshaw. They're they feel like they were very much of a time, like the English Beat, very much of a time, but music that I still, if I hear it now, I'm happy to listen to it.
Yeah, I used to have to go to friends' houses to watch MTV because my mother like refused to let us watch MTV. She thought men with
Oh.
long hair was every problem in the world was caused by men with long hair. Uh, that was her famous quote. And if we'd ever have it on, she'd be like, "That's not music, it's noise." And I'm like, you know, I don't know. Maybe it's because I
Yeah,
was always listening to like hair bands, but
right. Well, there was a lot of metal on MTV for
it
those years.
no,
Yeah.
it was that they really launched glam, glam metal. I mean, it was always around, but
Hmm.
you couldn't turn on MTV in 1987 and not see Bon Jovi at least once an hour.
It's true. And it is funny to look back on that, the hair. I mean, the crazy long fluffy hair of
Oh
all
yeah,
the metal bands.
I know. I still love it though. What about, so we talked about TV, we talked about music. What about writers? If you had if you had to be stranded on a desert island for a period of time, whose books would you want to bring with you?
Oh, wow. Books I would want to bring with me. I would bring books by um, Elizabeth Strout, who wrote Olive Kitteridge, which is sort of linked a novel in stories. And she's written 3 or 4 books about a character named Lucy Barton. Um, she has one out right now. Um, and I'm blanking on the name of it. I think it's called Lucy by the Sea. So she's followed the same character through several books. Who else would I read? I would read, there's certain writers who are just like automatic buys for me, like Meg Wolitzer or Celeste Ng, and um, and then one who's a little bit different that I don't know if you've read, Emily St. John Mandel. She wrote Station 11.
No, I know the book, but I've never
Yeah,
read it.
so that was sort of a pandemic novel, and then she has a new one out that came out last spring called Sea of Tranquility, that was a time travel story.
Mhm.
And I'm it's been sort of interesting. This is off topic a little bit, but there's a whole bunch of time travel novels out right now from writers who aren't speculative writers, really. There's, I think, time travel is having a moment somehow. But yeah, I feel like there are a lot of writers that I could just, if I could just have like all their books, that would be great. Tessa Hadley, Ann Tyler. Um, yeah, that's a hard question to answer though, especially if you can only pick one.
Right. Well, yeah, you can pick more than one, but that's okay. I got a good flavor for it. I wonder if time travel is so popular. I mean, if people were starting to write those during the pandemic, just like dreaming of, hey, if we could just go back in time and, and prevent this thing
Yeah,
from happening, and if that's the seed or the starting point of wanting to write a time travel. I love a good time travel story. I'm not gonna lie.
yeah, that's funny that you say that because I think at least 2 of them that I think Sea of Tranquility, Emily St. John Mandel wrote it during the pandemic, and I believe that Emma Straub's novel This Time Tomorrow she wrote during the pandemic. So yeah, I think that makes sense actually.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Sometimes I say
Hmm.
smart things. Um, how about lessons you learned about yourself while writing and going through the publishing process for The Wrong Kind of Woman? Any big lessons or insights to share?
Oh, lessons to share. Wow. It's a lesson. I don't know if I learned this. It's a lesson that I have had to learn over and over in different ways. And I have first learned it from uh, one of my writing teachers, and I can't remember who it is, but it's the concept of um, giving yourself permission to keep writing and you're giving yourself permission uh, to say that you're a writer. And because you were mentioning rejection earlier when we were talking, and there is so much rejection at every level. And even when you do get the thing you thought you wanted, like the agent or the book deal, there's still many more. Uh, there's still no guarantee either about the sales of your book, or will you get another book deal, or um, any number of things. So I I think that's a lesson that I have to keep reminding myself to just, you know, give yourself permission. And this is how the process goes. And the joy of it is in the writing, not in the um, I don't know, checking your sales figures or things like that. My puppy is biting my wrist, which is why I keep looking over to the
Oh,
side.
no, I saw the little fellow before.
The
So
nose, yeah,
we're dog friendly on Uncorking a Story, so it's all good. But we'll call it Unbarking a Story at some point if the dog decides to make his or her voice heard. And then, if you could write yourself, talking about time travel, if you could go back in time and give your younger self some words of advice, what would you share with the younger Sarah?
Oh, I would definitely say, don't be afraid to, don't be afraid to think of yourself as a creative writer or as a creative person, and don't be afraid to put yourself out there, even if you feel foolish or that you don't really have the right to be doing that. That everyone has the right to try. Everyone has the right to try to write or to write songs or whatever is the creative thing they want to do. And I think when you're in your teens and maybe into your 20s, you do have that worry about you're still figuring out who you are, and worrying about looking foolish maybe takes up too big a portion of your brain. At least that was true for me. So yeah, I guess I would say, don't be afraid, or be braver and take a risk.
Yeah, it brings us kind of full circle from where we started, where you were kind of talking about not feeling like you were a creative writer and more of a nonfiction, but certainly some good advice to give your younger self. Well, where can people pick up The Wrong Kind of Woman, Sarah?
Well, it's in independent bookstores, and you can also order it from your independent bookstore, and certainly Amazon. It's in the usual places. And if you need like a quick link, you can just go to my website. There are buttons for all the outlets on the homepage there somewhere. And my website is just sarahmccrawcrow.com, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but that's my writer name.
And then if people want to follow you, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, do you have, are you active on social media?
Yes, I am on Instagram. I think it's just my name, Sarah McCraw Crow. If you put that into the search in Instagram, it will come up. And same for Twitter and Facebook. And I'm more active on Instagram, I would say, than on either. I'm moderately active on Facebook and moderately active on Twitter, but I find Instagram more of a comfortable place to be talking about books and writing and stuff like that.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to put all of that in our show notes, along with links to your website. And I wish you all the best, Sarah. This is a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Thanks a lot. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.